Arafat was both the symbol of the Palestinians' hope for a viable independent state and the prime obstacle to its realization. He was never able to reach the heights of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who won back the Sinai through a peace treaty with Israel, because he was able to reach out to Israelis and address their fears and hopes. With his visit to Jerusalem in 1977, quoting Shlomo Avineri, an Israeli political philosopher and former government official. Turning to fact, 6 years earlier, in February 1971, Sadat had offered a full peace treaty to Israel in return for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, specifically the Egyptian Sinai. The Golda Meir Labor government rejected Sadat's offer, preferring to expand into the Sinai, where troops under the command of General Sharon were driving thousands of Bedouins into the desert and demolishing their towns in order to build the all-Jewish city of Yamit, along with kibbutzim and other Jewish villages. Sadat's offer was closely in accord with official U.S. policy, but Washington decided to back Israel's rejection of it, adopting Kissinger's policy of stalemate, no negotiations, only force. U.S.-Israeli rejection of diplomacy led directly to the 1973 war, which was a very close call for Israel and the world. The United States declared a nuclear alert. Kissinger realized that Egypt could not simply be dismissed, and agreed to pursue a diplomatic path, which led finally to the Camp David Accords of 1979, in which the United States and Israel accepted the offer that Sadat had made in 1971. The accords appear in history as a U.S. diplomatic triumph. In reality, Washington's performance was a diplomatic disaster, causing immense suffering and even danger of global war. In 1971, Sadat's peace offer said nothing about Palestinian rights, which were not yet on the international agenda. By the mid-1970s, that had changed, and Sadat insisted on Palestinian national rights in the occupied territories, the international consensus that the United States and Israel have rejected, virtually alone. Hence, the Egyptian offer to which the United States and Israel agreed at Camp David was harsher, from their point of view, from the one they had rejected 8 years earlier. Acceptance of Sadat's 1971 offer would have effectively ended the international conflict. There might have been progress toward settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict as well, had the United States and Israel been willing to contemplate the possibility. General Shlomo Gazit, military commander of the occupied territories from 1967 to 1974, reports in his memoirs that Palestinian leaders proposed various forms of local autonomy in the territories during these years. These were transmitted sympathetically by Israeli military intelligence, but rejected or ignored by the higher political echelons, which insisted on substantial border changes and had no intention of reaching any agreement, acting with determination to thwart any Palestinian hopes in that direction, while Israel forbade any political activity. By adopting this extreme rejectionist stance, Gazit believes the U.S.-backed labor governments of the early 1970s bear significant responsibility for the rise of the fanatic Gush Imunim settler movement, and eventually the Palestinian resistance that developed many years later in the First Intifada, after years of state terror, settler brutality, and steady takeover of valuable Palestinian lands and resources. Along with arable land, the most important of these resources is water, leaving Palestinians under occupation the most water-deprived people in the entire region, indeed one of the most deprived in the world, while Israel takes for itself 80% of the water extracted from West Bank aquifers, arrangements now consolidated by the separation wall on transparently fraudulent security grounds. In further robbery and humiliation, Israel plans to take the West Bank's largest quarry for illegal transfer of garbage from Israel, depriving Palestinians of its use and jeopardizing remaining Palestinian water resources, according to pollution experts. While keeping largely to political and diplomatic history, we should not overlook the human reality of the occupation, described succinctly by Israeli historian Benny Morris. Israelis like to believe, and tell the world, that they were running an enlightened or benign occupation, qualitatively different from other military occupations the world had seen. The truth was radically different. Like all occupations, Israel's was founded on brute force, repression and fear, collaboration and treachery, beatings and torture chambers, and daily intimidation, humiliation, and manipulation. True, the relative lack of resistance and civil disobedience over the years enabled Israelis to maintain the facade of normalcy and implement their rule with a relatively small force, consisting of a handful of IDF battalions. A few dozen police officers, rank-and-file policemen were recruited from among the Palestinians, and 100 or so General Security Service GSS case officers and investigators. There is good reason to believe that prior to the October 1973 war, Israel could have moved towards some sort of federal arrangement in Mandatory Palestine, with two partially autonomous regions, predominantly Jewish and Arab. The Palestinian proposals that were dismissed by the political leadership could have been steps in this direction. A federal solution could have led to further integration of the two societies, as circumstances permitted, leading to the kind of binational arrangement that has significant roots in pre-state Zionism, and is quite natural in that region, in fact, more generally. There are many models of multinational states, some reasonably successful, often considerably more so than the state systems that have largely been imposed by violence, and have often led to horrendous atrocities. Anyone familiar with this matter knows that any line drawn through it is highly artificial, though certainly superior to military occupation. During those years, there was some, if limited, public advocacy of such moves, but after the 1973 war, the opportunity was lost, and the only serious short-term option became the two-state settlement of the international consensus that the United States and Israel have blocked. The basic facts are clear. It was not the villain Arafat who was the prime obstacle to the realization of a Palestinian state, but rather the United States and Israel, with the help of media and commentary that suppressed and distorted what was taking place. That conclusion is even more sharply drawn when we look at the actual record, since the issue of Palestinian national rights reached the international agenda in the mid-1970s. In 1976, the United States vetoed a Syrian-initiated resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international borders, backed by the major Arab states and Arafat's PLO, and incorporating the crucial wording of UN Security Council Resolution 242, recognized on all sides to be the basic diplomatic document. In the years that followed, the United States, virtually alone, blocked the very broad international consensus on a similar diplomatic resolution, while supporting Israel's expansion into the occupied territories. The legal status of the takeover of lands and resources is not seriously in question. The prominent Israeli legal scholar David Kretzmer, professor of international law at the Hebrew University, observes that the illegality of the settlements has been accepted by the United Nations Security Council, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, the states, parties to the Geneva Conventions, along with foreign governments and academic writers, and more recently by the International Court of Justice, unanimously, including U.S. Justice Bergenthal. The United States continues to block a diplomatic resolution. One important recent example was the presentation of the Geneva Accord in December 2002. These detailed proposals for a two-state solution, formulated by unofficial but prominent Israeli and Palestinian negotiators, were supported by the usual broad international consensus, with the usual exception. The United States, conspicuously, was not among the governments sending a message of support.